Uh, Let me begin by acknowledging the Amri and Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodian of the land in which we meet today, and pay my respects for their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today we have a very excellent speaker, Dr. Annie Song. She is a Postdoctoral Research Associate at the University of Technology, Sydney. And today's seminar will be titled China's Approach to Global Fisheries, Power in the Governance of Anti-Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing. So we will record this seminar presentation, but we will stop the recording during the Q&A. So time is yours, Annie.
Thank you, Rini. Hi, my name is Annie Song. As Rini introduced, I'm a Postdoctoral Research Associate and the Ocean Nexus Research Fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney. And today's presentation is about our paper on China's approach to global fisheries. And I have two co-authors, Associate Professor Michael Fabini and Professor Kate Barclay, also based at the UTS. So this paper has been published already in the Environmental Politics, and it's open access. So if you're interested, you'll be able to download the paper from the website as well after the talk. So this is the outline of today's presentation. I'll briefly introduce the background of China's distant water fishing, and then I'll talk about China's power in anti-IUU fishing policy, and then I'll move on to power in domestic politics, and then we'll talk about institutional and productive power, and I'll finish off with the conclusions. So China's distant water fishing fleet has been criticized for its unsustainable fishing practices, along with its potential geopolitical impacts. So in 2018, the Global Illegal Fishing Index ranked the Chinese fleet as the most likely to be engaged in illegal fishing activities. And China remains as top country that is likely to engage in IUU fishing actions in 2021. However, China's recent policies show that it is trying to do better in terms of making fishing practice more sustainable and more aligned with international norms of anti-IUU fishing. And I have 3 examples here, and I'll discuss them in detail later. Well, the 13th 5-year Ocean Fisheries Development Plan in 2017 limited the growth of the distant water fishing vessels, which is DWF vessels, and China revised DWF management regulation in 2020 for the first time since its introduction in 2003. And the last one here is about implementing squid fishing moratoriums on certain high seas of areas of South America. Yet we still see the news reporting that China's DWF fleet is potentially engaging in IUU fishing actions. Despite the criticism, China has been framing itself as a responsible major state in fishing. So then how do we understand China's apparently incoherent stance regarding anti-IUU fishing? We argue that China is expanding its influence in ocean governance by projecting itself as a legitimate leader of international community, especially in the eyes of those challenging China's maritime action through norm setting in international negotiations and its domestic anti-IUU fishing policy. And we define power as both intangible and tangible power. And we focus on intangible power here, specifically institutional and productive power, which is drawing upon Barnett and Duval's work published in International Organization in 2005. By exercising these indirect types of power, an actor sets up the rules and discourses that become legitimized in the long term without generating conflicts. By applying this notion, we see that China exercises intangible power in two-level games, advancing its preferences in international negotiations while also satisfying domestic audiences. And we mean the Chinese DWF industry as domestic audiences here. So at this point, you might wonder, does Chinese DWF industry represent Chinese states? The answer is yes and no, because China's governance is highly fragmented, as discussed in Johnson Zhao 2017, published in New Political Economy. Chinese distant water fishing industry can be seen as more independent business entities. However, it does not mean that it is completely free from government control. In fact, in the recent study by Rutert and Eaton in 2021, shows that there are higher state ownership and overseas expansion under Xi's leadership. And also there are a lot of subsidies provided to distant water fishing industry and port facilities built in China that is to support DWF industry. So in this sense, the Chinese state intends to safeguard SOEs, which is a state-owned enterprises interest, as they can contribute to its policy priorities in economic and strategic goals. So coming back to the intangible power aspects of our argument, institutional power is the capacity to shape institutions to define permissible and non-permissible actions. So it means that by exercising power, actors can shape the anti-IUU fishing rules to define what fishing activities are allowed. And for China, ultimate goal of having this type of power is to protect its DWF industry and geopolitical/strategic interests. Then what did China do to exercise this institutional power? First, it introduced the anti-IUU fishing regulations, and second, it shaped the anti-IUU fishing rules, norms in a preferred way. So China introduced domestic anti-IUU fishing regulations. First, it limited the growth of DWF fleets to a cap of 3,000 vessels by 2020 and restricted the growth rate of the number of DWF companies entirely from 2016 baseline. Second, it revised the DWF management regulation in 2020 for the first time since its introduction in 2003, highlighting the protection and sustainability of fisheries resources captured by DWF. Finally, it implemented moratoriums for squid fishing on high seas off the Southwest Atlantic Ocean and East Pacific Ocean for 2 seasons. But these regulations did not eliminate IUU IUU activities entirely. There was no reduction in the goal of DWF catch in 2020. And 2020 DWF management regulation does not apply to individuals and organizations engaged in fishing activities in disputed territories of the Western Pacific Ocean, including the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea and South China Sea, where there have been confrontations between Chinese fishing vessels and other countries with accusation of illegal fishing. And finally, fishing moratoriums introduced in June 2020 do not seem to fundamentally resolve the Chinese DWF fleet's IUU fishing, as we saw a massive number of Chinese fishing vessels linger nearby Peru and more in recent cases. And second point relates to shaping anti-IUU fishing rules and norms in a preferred way. In negotiations on eliminating fisheries subsidies in world trade organizations, China showed a preference for domestic or regional fisheries management organization definitions over single internationally agreed upon definition of IUU fishing. And it also stated that any alleged IUU fishing activities involving disputes concerning territoriality or sovereignty or maritime jurisdiction shall be excluded. And it also preferred special and differential treatment for developing and least developing countries as a self-claimed developing country. Another example of China's engagement in international negotiation is BBNJ, which is beyond biodiversity of areas beyond the national jurisdiction, where countries discuss the ways for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond the national jurisdiction. So at the heart of this negotiation, there is this should not undermine clause. It's about this new instrument should not undermine existing legal instruments and relevant global, regional, and sectorial organizations. And China supports this as it opposes the potential effects of BBNJ on fisheries governance. On the same note, it resists to include the fisheries resources to BBNJ agreement. And it also argues that conservation should be used as a tool rather than objective itself. And like the WTO negotiation, this BBNJ negotiation is still an ongoing one. So we'll have to see how the outcome would come out after all. So then we argue that China's engagement with the anti-IUU fishing norms represent institutional power, steering IUU fishing rules to incorporate China's fishing interests into domestic and international institutions. The generation of institutional power subsequently feeds into productive power through the opportunity to increase the legitimacy of its actions and the role in the maritime sphere. But by saying this, we note the similarities between China and other major distant water fishing countries like Japan and the US, where actors are eager to push forward their interests to international negotiations. What is different is that China did not have a capacity and political will to shape the rules in fisheries management in organizations like our regional fisheries management organizations in their early days. However, China's recent approach shows that its ambition to play a more active role in international negotiations with the growing economic and political capacity. So productive power involves generalized social processes, making certain practice and policies possible, imaginable, and desirable in world politics. So it means that the actor's action can be taken for granted and the ordinary of world politics. So for China, having this productive power means gaining legitimacy as a maritime power. To this end, China did two things. First is to legitimize the Chinese version of anti-IUU fishing rules. And second is to project its ambition to become a maritime power. With domestic anti-IUU fishing policy in place, China claims itself as a legitimate fishing country and deflect accusation about Chinese vessels' illegal maritime actions. And through advancing its preferences in an international negotiation of anti-IUU fishing rules, it intends to protect maritime interests, meaning that it wants to maintain fishing activities in distant water. So in this sense, China's fishing activities are following the rules which are fused with the China's self-interest would be seen as legitimate and acceptable maritime actions, contributing to empowering productive power and making the notion China practicing sustainable fishing an unchallenged norm in the long run. The aspiration to become a legitimate maritime power comes from ambition to play a leadership role in global governance. The Chinese government specified its interest in maritime development, and its slogan, Maritime Community with a Shared Future, represents its ambition to become a maritime power with the Chinese wisdom and characteristics. And recently, China shows its interest to fulfill responsibility as a power, meaning that it is more willing to pursue justice, quote unquote, to become a great power. Having said that, we are not arguing that China's action towards anti-IUU fishing reflects a genuine moral shift on environmental responsibility, as our empirical materials do not enable us to determine this either way. Instead, what we can say is that seemingly incoherent actions reveal an ambition to seize the intangible dimension of its inspired power. So to conclude, drawing upon the idea of power operating in two-level gains and institutional and productive exercise of power, we argue that China's incoherent approach to anti-IUU fishing can be explained by its aspiration to become a legitimate power in maritime space. And in this sense, we highlight that China's policy reaches beyond its its tangible maritime interests alone, and to attempt to gain legitimacy for its aspired great power role while persisting with its maritime interests. So now we come to so what questions. So there are two implications of this study. First, China's environmental responsibility is not likely to exceed China's self-interest and is likely to remain within the limit of what China can control. Second, our study contributes to making sense of China's evolving and sometimes rather confusing approach to environmental governance at large. So this is the end of the presentation. So thank you for listening. And if you have any comments, you can reach me at youngsong@uts.edu.au. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annie, for a very excellent presentations, and congratulations on the publications